They say the devil doesn't carry a pitchfork. He wears a bespoke Brioni suit, drinks neat Macallan, and controls the city from a penthouse. When 24-year-old Genevieve Hayes walked into the most dangerous room in Chicago to beg for her brother's life, she didn't expect mercy. She expected a bullet. Instead, the ruthless head of the Costello syndicate looked at her, heard a Strauss waltz echoing through the ballroom, and made a sarcastic, chilling wager. "If you dance this waltz, I'll marry you." He laughed, expecting her to crumble. But she didn't, and the ending to this story, it's going to leave you completely speechless. The Gold Coast room at the Drake Hotel was practically vibrating with the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself. It was November 14th, a freezing Tuesday night in Chicago, but inside the ballroom, the air was thick with the heat of cigar smoke, expensive Tom Ford cologne, and quiet, dangerous deals. Genevieve Hayes stood in the shadows near the service elevators, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was a classically trained cellist who taught music to middle schoolers in Evanston. But her older brother, Leo, had a sickness. Not the kind you cure with medicine, but the kind that festers at underground poker tables. Leo owed $200,000 to Arthur Costello. Arthur Costello wasn't a man you owed money to. At 32, he had inherited the Costello syndicate after his father's sudden, violent demise. Arthur had ruthlessly purged the ranks, solidifying his empire. The FBI had files on him thick enough to stop a bullet, but he was a ghost. Untouchable, meticulous, and entirely devoid of empathy. Or so the whispers in the city said. Genevieve adjusted the borrowed emerald green silk dress, its fabric clinging to her trembling frame. She had bribed a catering manager she knew from her days playing string quartets at weddings just to get through the kitchen doors. Her mission was suicidal. Find Arthur Costello, look him in the eye, and beg for a payment plan. Leo was currently hiding in a motel in Gary, Indiana, convinced he wouldn't live to see the weekend. She scanned the room. It didn't take long to spot him. Arthur was seated in a velvet wingback chair in the VIP alcove, flanked by men whose tailored suits couldn't hide the unmistakable bulge of shoulder holsters. He wasn't monstrously large, but he possessed a gravitational pull. His dark hair was immaculately styled, his jawline sharp, and his eyes, even from a distance, were a piercing, cold slate grey. He was listening to an older man speak, his expression one of polite, terrifying boredom. Just walk up to him, Genevieve told herself. He's just a man. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she stepped out of the shadows. The clinking of crystal glasses and low murmurs of the crowd seemed to fade into a dull roar in her ears. She navigated through the sea of mobsters, corrupt politicians, and high society socialites who turned a blind eye to where the money came from. As she approached the alcove, a massive man with a scarred eyebrow, Vincent, Arthur's notoriously brutal underboss, stepped into a path. His hand rested casually inside his jacket. "Lost, sweetheart?" Vincent's voice was like grinding gravel. "The bar is that way." "I need to speak with Mr. Costello," Genevieve said. To her credit, her voice only wavered slightly. Vincent chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Mr. Costello doesn't do meet and greets. Turn around before I have you thrown out the service exit." "It's about Leo Hayes," she pushed back, raising her chin. "I'm his sister. Genevieve." The mention of the name caught the attention of the man in the chair. Arthur Costello slowly raised a hand, 2 fingers extended. Vincent immediately stepped aside, though his glare remained fixed on her throat. Arthur leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked her up and down, dissecting her in a fraction of a second. He saw the borrowed dress, the lack of expensive jewelry, the sheer terror masked by desperate defiance. "Leo Hayes," Arthur murmured. His voice was smooth, cultured, lacking the rough Chicago accent of his subordinates. "I was beginning to think Leo had taken up permanent residence at the bottom of Lake Michigan. He owes me a substantial amount of money, Miss Hayes, money that was due yesterday." "I know," Genevieve said, stepping closer, ignoring Vincent's warning growl. "He doesn't have it. But I can pay you. I can get a loan. I can work." Arthur laughed. It wasn't a booming laugh, but a quiet, sharp sound of genuine amusement. "You? Alone?" "Miss Hayes, unless you're hiding a tech startup in that silk dress, you don't have the collateral to cover your brother's indiscretions. He stole from me. It's a matter of principle now." "Please," she pleaded, dropping the tough facade. "He's all the family I have left. I'll do anything." The words hung in the air. Anything. It was the most dangerous word a desperate person could use in a room full of predators. A heavy silence descended over the alcove, save for the faint strains of the orchestra tuning up on the main stage. Arthur stared at her, his grey eyes devoid of warmth. He despised desperation. He found it pathetic. Yet there was something about the way she stood her ground, trembling but unbroken, that caught his attention. At that moment, the orchestra began to play. It was Dmitri Shostakovich's Waltz No. 2, a sweeping, dramatic, and slightly melancholic piece. Arthur stood up. He was taller than she had realized, towering over her. He slowly buttoned his suit jacket, never breaking eye contact. "You'll do anything," Arthur repeated softly, testing the weight of the word. He glanced towards the dance floor, where a few elite couples were beginning to sway to the 3/4 time signature. A cruel, cynical smile touched the corners of his mouth. He looked back at Genevieve. "Do you know how to waltz, Miss Hayes?" Genevieve blinked, completely thrown off guard. "What?" "It's a simple question," he said, stepping out of the alcove. The air around him seemed to freeze. "I've had a terribly boring evening. I deal with liars, thieves, and sycophants all day. Your brother is a rat who stole from my table. By all rights, Vincent should take you to the basement right now, just to send Leo a message." Genevieve swallowed hard, her blood running cold. "But," Arthur continued, extending a hand towards the dance floor, "I am a man who appreciates the arts. And you, Genevieve, have a certain reckless bravery that amuses me." He stepped closer until she could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "So here is my offer. A joke, really. But let's see how far your anything goes. If you dance this waltz with me, right here, right now." He paused, his smile widening into something almost predatory. "I'll marry you." Vincent let out a sharp cough of surprise. The guards exchanged confused glances. Arthur laughed again, a harsh, mocking sound. "I'll marry you, clear your brother's debt, and you will be placed under the absolute protection of the Costello family. But there's a catch," he leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "If you miss a single step, if you tremble, if you lose the rhythm, or if you pull away before the song ends, Vincent will go to Gary, Indiana tonight, and your brother's head will be delivered to your doorstep in a hat box. Do we have a deal?" It was a sick, twisted game. He was mocking her. He expected her to run crying from the room. A Mafia boss marrying a school teacher over a dance. It was a dark fairy tale designed to humiliate her before he exacted his vengeance. But Genevieve had been trained in classical music since she was 5. She understood tempo. She understood performance under pressure. And she knew she had absolutely no other choice. She looked at Arthur's outstretched hand. Then she looked up into his cold, slate-grey eyes. "Lead," she whispered. Arthur's mocking smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He hadn't expected her to accept. Slowly, his hand closed around hers. His grip was firm, calloused, and surprisingly warm. He pulled her onto the polished mahogany floor of the Gold Coast room. The moment they stepped into the light, the room went completely still. Whispers erupted among the guests. Who was the girl in green? Why was Arthur Costello, a man who never danced, taking the floor? Arthur placed his right hand firmly on her waist, pulling her flush against him. It wasn't a polite, high society hold. It was possessive, dominant. Genevieve placed her left hand on his shoulder, her fingers resting against the expensive wool of his suit. 1, 2, 3. Arthur counted softly, and they stepped into the waltz. The Shostakovich piece is deceptively fast. It requires a sweeping, gliding motion, a perfect synchronization of two bodies. Genevieve was terrified, but the moment the music took over, muscle memory kicked in. She had played this piece hundreds of times. She knew every crescendo, every pause, every breath of the music. Arthur was a surprisingly graceful dancer, moving with the lethal, controlled fluidity of a predator. He spun her across the floor, his eyes locked onto hers. He was searching for a mistake, waiting for her to stumble so he could end the game. "Your hand is shaking," he murmured as they glided past the orchestra. "Your men are watching us like they want to shoot me," she shot back, her breath hitching as he dipped her sharply. "It's distracting." Arthur's eyes flared with a sudden, unreadable emotion. "Keep your eyes on me, Genevieve. Only me." The music swelled, the brass and strings building to a dramatic climax. They spun faster and faster. The rest of the room blurred into a smear of gold lights and dark suits. Genevieve felt lightheaded, her lungs burning, but she didn't miss a beat. She matched him step for step, her emerald dress flaring around them. For 3 minutes. The terrifying mob boss and the desperate music teacher moved as a single entity. As the final chord crashed through the room, Arthur pulled her to a sudden, dramatic stop. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling against his. Her hand was still securely in his, her other hand gripping his shoulder. She hadn't missed a single step. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. No one clapped, no one breathed. They were all watching Arthur Costello. Arthur stared down at the woman in his arms. The amusement was entirely gone from his face, replaced by a dark, dangerous intensity. He had made a sarcastic wager, expecting to break her. Instead, she had matched his fire. He slowly released her waist. He turned to Vincent, who was staring in shock. "Vincent!" Arthur's voice cut through the silence like a whip. "Call off the hounds in Indiana. Leo Hayes' debt is cleared." He turned back to Genevieve, his expression unreadable. He reached out and gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "And Vincent," Arthur added, never taking his eyes off her, "call the family lawyer. Tell him to draft a prenuptial agreement. It seems I'm getting married." 3 weeks later, Genevieve Hayes became Genevieve Costello in a private ceremony at City Hall, followed by a quiet, tense dinner at Arthur's sprawling, fortified estate in Lake Forest. It was a marriage on paper, born of a twisted wager. But the reality of her new life was far more complex than she could have ever imagined. Arthur had kept his word. Leo was safe, his debt erased, and he had been quietly relocated to a rehab facility in Arizona on Arthur's dime. But Genevieve quickly learned that Arthur Costello didn't do anything without a calculated reason. He hadn't married her just because she danced well. He had married her because he needed a shield. The Costello syndicate was currently engaged in a brutal, invisible war with a rival faction moving in from Detroit. Arthur needed to project stability. A sudden, quiet marriage to a civilian, a beautiful, innocent music teacher, softened his public image, confusing his enemies, and keeping the federal authorities guessing. She was his perfect alibi, his immaculate cover story. Genevieve's new home was a fortress masquerading as a mansion. The Lake Forest estate was surrounded by 12-foot iron gates, patrolled by silent men in dark coats, and filled with priceless art that felt cold to the touch. She was given a massive suite on the second floor, a limitless credit card she refused to use, and absolute freedom to roam the house, except for the East Wing, where Arthur conducted his business. They lived like ghosts orbiting the same haunted house. Arthur worked relentlessly. He would leave before dawn and return long after midnight, smelling of rain, exhaust, and occasionally copper and smoke. Yet there were moments of strange, unsettling domesticity. One rainy Tuesday evening, Genevieve was in the library. It was a massive 2-story room filled with first editions. She had brought her cello from her old apartment and was sitting by the window, playing a mournful Bach suite. She had her eyes closed, losing herself in the music, trying to forget the golden cage she was trapped in. When she finished and opened her eyes, she gasped. Arthur was standing in the doorway. He had shed his suit jacket, his tie was loosened, and he looked utterly exhausted. He was holding a glass of amber liquid. "Don't stop," he said quietly. "I didn't hear you come in," she said, carefully setting the bow down. "I try not to be heard," he replied, walking slowly into the room. He sat heavily in a leather armchair opposite her. He looked at her, really looked at her, with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You play with a lot of anger for someone so gentle." "I have a lot to be angry about," Genevieve countered softly. "I'm a prisoner in a mansion, married to a man who scares everyone in this city." Arthur took a slow sip of his drink. "You're not a prisoner, Genevieve. The gates are to keep the monsters out, not to keep you in." "And what about the monster inside?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Arthur didn't flinch. A bitter smile touched his lips. "The monster inside is the only reason you and your brother are still breathing. Never forget that." He stood up, walking over to the window. The rain lashed against the glass. "There is a charity gala this weekend at the Field Museum. The mayor will be there, along with the chief of police and several men who would very much like to see me dead. You will wear my mother's diamonds. You will smile. You will play the part of the devoted, naive wife." He turned his head to look at her over his shoulder. "Can you do that? Or did your bravery expire on the dance floor?" Genevieve stood up, meeting his gaze. She was starting to realize that beneath the cold, ruthless exterior, Arthur was a man constantly balancing on a razor's edge, and terrifyingly, she was starting to feel drawn to him. "I kept my end of the bargain, Arthur," she said firmly. "I'll play the part." He stared at her for a long moment, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. Slowly, he crossed the room until he was standing just inches from her. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before his knuckles gently grazed her jawline. "You are the most unexpected variable I've ever introduced into my life, Genevieve," he whispered, his voice dark and heavy. "Let's hope it doesn't get us both killed." The Field Museum of Natural History was transformed into a glittering playground for Chicago's elite. Under the towering, amber-lit skeleton of Sue the T-Rex, the city's power brokers sipped Dom Perignon and exchanged hollow pleasantries. For Genevieve, the Grand Hall felt like a beautifully decorated gladiatorial arena. She wore a breathtaking midnight blue gown that Arthur had ordered specifically for her from Paris. Around her neck rested the Costello family diamonds, a staggering, brilliant-cut necklace that felt less like an heirloom and more like a very expensive, very heavy collar. Arthur was a revelation in a stark black tuxedo. He moved through the crowd with the effortless grace of a shark gliding through a coral reef. The society pages called him a wealthy logistics magnate. The men who nervously cleared a path for him knew he was the most dangerous predator in the room, and he kept Genevieve anchored to his side, his hand resting firmly, possessively on the small of her back. "Smile, Genevieve," Arthur murmured, his lips barely moving as he nodded to a passing alderman. "You look like you're walking to the gallows." "It's hard to smile when half the people here are wondering how long I'll survive you," she whispered back, though she stretched her lips into a flawless, practiced curve. Arthur's hand tightened slightly against her spine, sending a jolt of unexpected heat through her silk dress. "Let them wonder. As long as you are on my arm, you are untouchable. Remember the role." The role. She was the naive, adored bride, and for the first hour she played it perfectly. She laughed at the mayor's dry jokes, charmed the wives of shipping executives with stories of her cello students, and allowed Arthur to occasionally lean down and press a soft, lingering kiss to her temple for the benefit of the society photographers. Every time his lips touched her skin, she felt a dangerous flutter in her chest that had absolutely nothing to do with acting. But the illusion shattered halfway through the evening. Arthur was cornered by Mayor Richard Hughes and a visibly sweating police commissioner. He gave Genevieve a subtle, commanding look, "Stay put," before stepping away toward the towering mammoth exhibit to speak in hushed, urgent tones. Genevieve retreated to a quieter corner near a champagne tower, taking a deep breath to steady her racing heart. "Beautiful necklace," a smooth, unfamiliar voice said. Arthur's mother wore it the night his father was gunned down outside the opera. Quite a heavy legacy for a school teacher. Genevieve turned sharply. Standing beside her was a man with slicked-back blonde hair, a sharp, cruel face, and a tailored suit that looked just a little too flashy for the old-money crowd. His eyes were pale, assessing her with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Genevieve said, her voice dropping to an icy register she didn't know she possessed. The man smirked, extending a hand she refused to take. "Victor Sterling. I do a lot of business across the lake. Detroit, mostly." Detroit. The rival syndicate Arthur was currently fighting a silent, bloody war against. Genevieve's blood ran cold, but she kept her chin high. "If you're looking for my husband, Mr. Sterling, he's currently occupied. I suggest you make an appointment with his office." Victor chuckled, stepping uncomfortably close. The smell of strong mint and cheap cologne hit her. "I'm not here for Arthur, sweetheart. I'm here to offer my condolences. It must be terrible marrying a monster just to save your deadbeat brother. Leo's debts are none of your concern," she said, stepping back. "Debts?" Victor's laugh was sharp and grating. "Is that what Arthur told you? That Leo just had a bad run at the blackjack table?" He leaned in, lowering his voice to a venomous whisper. "Your brother didn't owe Arthur 200 grand from gambling, Genevieve. He owed it because he was stealing from the Costello shipping manifests and selling the routes to my employers in Detroit." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The classical music floating down from the balcony faded into a high-pitched ringing in her ears. "You're lying," she breathed, her hands trembling so violently she had to set her champagne flute on a passing tray. "Leo is a rat," Victor continued, his pale eyes gleaming with malice. "A corporate spy. He played both sides, and he got caught. Arthur didn't marry you because he likes the way you dance. He married you because Detroit was going to kidnap you to force Leo to testify against the Costellos. By putting a ring on your finger, Arthur made you untouchable family. He didn't save you, Genevieve. He turned you into a human shield to protect his empire. Get away from my wife, Victor." The voice was low, deadly, and entirely devoid of emotion. Victor froze. Genevieve looked past him to see Arthur standing there. The polite society mask was gone. In its place was the ruthless, terrifying mob boss she had met in the Gold Coast room. Vincent had materialized seemingly out of thin air, standing 2 steps behind Arthur, his hand resting inside his jacket. Victor raised his hands in mock surrender, forcing a tight smile. "Just introducing myself to the lovely bride, Arthur. No harm done. If you ever speak to her again, Victor, they won't find enough of you to fill a shoebox," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper. "Leave Chicago. Tonight. Or don't leave it at all." Victor swallowed hard, the bravado evaporating. He gave Genevieve one last pitying look before disappearing into the crowd. Arthur immediately turned his attention to Genevieve. He saw the color drained from her face, the way she was gripping the edge of the linen-draped table to stay upright. Without a word, he grabbed her hand and pulled her through a set of heavy mahogany doors out onto a private, dimly lit stone terrace overlooking Lake Michigan. The freezing November wind whipped off the water, but Genevieve barely felt it. Arthur dropped her hand and turned to face her, his chest heaving slightly. "What did he say to you?" Genevieve stared at the man she had bound her life to. The elegant suit, the handsome face, the protective warmth. It was all a beautifully constructed lie. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "Did Leo sell your shipping routes to Detroit? Was he a spy?" Arthur's jaw tightened. He looked away, staring out at the dark, churning waters of the lake. He didn't answer immediately, which was all the answer she needed. "Tell me the truth, Arthur," she screamed, slapping her hand against his chest. Arthur caught her wrist effortlessly, his grip firm but not bruising. He pulled her flush against him, his grey eyes blazing with a fierce, turbulent intensity. "Yes," Arthur hissed. "Your brother is a traitor, Genevieve. He sold out my family. Men died because of the information he leaked to Detroit. He wasn't just gambling. He was playing a high-stakes game of treason, and he lost." Tears blurred her vision. The brother she had sacrificed everything for, the brother she had stepped into a Mafia den for, had been playing her, too. "And the marriage," she choked out. "Victor said Detroit was coming for me, that you only married me to keep them from using you as leverage against him," Arthur finished for her, his voice harsh. "Yes, Detroit knew Leo loved you. They were going to take you, torture you, and send pieces of you to Leo until he gave up everything he knew about my operation. When you walked into that ballroom, you walked right into a crossfire you didn't even know existed." Genevieve felt her knees buckle, the absolute weight of the betrayal crushing her. But Arthur didn't let her fall. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tightly against his chest, shielding her from the freezing wind. "I made a choice that night," Arthur murmured, his lips pressed against her hair, his voice suddenly stripped of its icy armor. "I could have let them take you. I could have killed Leo. But I watched you stand up to me. I watched you waltz with a target on your back and not miss a single goddamn step." He pulled back just enough to force her to look at him. His eyes were frantic, searching hers. "I married you to protect my empire, Genevieve. That was the plan. But keeping you alive, keeping you safe from Detroit, from Leo's mess, from everything." He swallowed hard, his thumb brushing a tear from her cheek. "That has become entirely personal." The revelation on the terrace of the Field Museum fundamentally shifted the axis of Genevieve's world. For 3 days following the gala, a suffocating silence draped over the Lake Forest estate. She didn't touch her cello. She didn't leave her suite. She sat in the window seat, staring out at the frost-covered grounds, trying to reconcile the brother she had grown up with, the boy who taught her how to ride a bike, with the corporate spy who had willingly painted a target on her back. Leo hadn't been a victim of a gambling addiction. He had been playing a deadly game of corporate espionage between 2 rival Mafia syndicates, and when he lost, he had left Genevieve to pay the butcher's bill. Arthur gave her space, though she felt his presence everywhere. He doubled the perimeter guards. The men in dark coats were no longer trying to be invisible. They patrolled with unholstered weapons, their faces grim. The invisible war with Detroit had just gone loud. It happened on a Thursday at 2 a.m. Genevieve was lying awake, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, when the heavy oak door to her bedroom violently burst open. She bolted upright, a scream dying in her throat as a dark figure rushed in. "Get up! Now!" It was Arthur. He wasn't wearing his usual bespoke suit. He was in black tactical gear, a matte black Sig Sauer pistol gripped in his right hand. The cold, calculated composure he usually maintained was gone, replaced by the lethal urgency of a soldier under fire. "What's happening?" she gasped, throwing off the duvet. "Victor Sterling didn't heed my warning to leave the city," Arthur said, tossing a heavy Kevlar-lined jacket onto the bed. "Put that on, over your nightgown. Do it now, Genevieve." Before she could slip her arms into the sleeves, the house shuddered. A deafening explosion echoed from the east wing, rattling the floorboards and shattering the reinforced glass of her bedroom window. A shockwave of freezing air and the acrid smell of smoke and sulfur rushed into the room. Genevieve dropped to her knees, covering her ears. Arthur was beside her in an instant, pulling her up. "Detroit brought a small army. They've breached the front gate. Vincent is holding the foyer, but there are too many of them. We need to move to the basement safe room." He grabbed her hand, pulling her into the dimly lit hallway. The sprawling mansion was in absolute chaos. The alarm system blared, a high-pitched, rhythmic shrieking. Below them, the sharp, staccato cracks of automatic gunfire echoed off the marble floors, followed by shouts and the sound of shattering, priceless vases. "Keep your head down," Arthur ordered, leading her towards the back staircase. They reached the landing overlooking the grand library. Through the balustrade, Genevieve saw 3 men in dark tactical gear kicking open the library doors. They weren't looking for ledgers or money. They were clearing rooms, hunting. Arthur shoved Genevieve against the wall, shielding her body with his own. He raised his weapon, his breathing slow and controlled, despite the madness around them. He fired twice. 2 of the men below dropped instantly. The third dove behind a heavy leather sofa, returning fire. Bullets chewed through the mahogany banister, inches from Genevieve's face, showering her with splintered wood. "Move!" Arthur yelled over the deafening noise. They scrambled down the secondary stairs, bypassing the kitchen, which was currently engulfed in a firefight between Arthur's security and Detroit's mercenaries. Arthur kicked open the heavy door leading to the wine cellar. The cellar was freezing, smelling of damp earth and aging oak. Arthur dragged her past racks of vintage Bordeaux until they reached a seemingly solid stone wall at the very back. He pressed his bloody hand against a hidden biometric scanner. With a heavy metallic groan, the stone wall slid open, revealing a reinforced steel door. Just as he punched in the secondary passcode, heavy footsteps echoed at the top of the cellar stairs. Well, well, if it isn't the happy couple. Victor Sterling stood at the top of the steps, a submachine gun resting casually against his hip. He looked down at them, a cruel, triumphant smile stretching across his face. "It's over, Arthur," Victor called out, slowly descending the wooden steps. "Your perimeter is gone. Vincent is bleeding out in the foyer. Detroit owns Chicago now. Give me the girl, and I'll make your death quick." Arthur pushed Genevieve behind him, his tall frame completely blocking her from Victor's line of sight. "You're a long way from home, Victor," Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "And you've made a fatal miscalculation." "Have I?" Victor sneered, raising the barrel of his gun. "You assumed," Arthur said softly, "that I fight fair." Arthur didn't raise his gun. Instead, he hit a small switch hidden beneath the lip of the wine rack next to him. The lights in the cellar instantly cut out, plunging the room into absolute, pitch-black darkness. At the exact same second, Arthur lunged. In the suffocating darkness, the sounds of the struggle were terrifying. Genevieve pressed her back against the cold steel of the safe room door, her hands clamped over her mouth to muffle her own ragged breathing. She heard a heavy thud, the clatter of a weapon hitting the stone floor, and a sickening crunch of bone. Then, a single gunshot deafened her in the enclosed space. The muzzle flash briefly illuminated the nightmare. Arthur and Victor locked in a brutal, desperate grapple on the floor. Silence followed, a heavy, dripping silence. Genevieve's heart hammered so hard it physically hurt. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Open the door," a strained, familiar voice rasped. Genevieve blindly reached for the keypad, her fingers slipping on the buttons until she managed to punch in the sequence Arthur had just used. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open, spilling the sterile white emergency lights of the safe room into the dark cellar. Arthur was leaning heavily against the wine racks, clutching his left side. Victor Sterling lay motionless at the bottom of the stairs. "Get in," Arthur grunted, stumbling forward. Genevieve grabbed his arm, hauling him into the small, concrete-lined room. The moment they crossed the threshold, Arthur hit the lock protocol. The steel door slammed shut, sealing them inside. A heavy array of locking mechanisms engaged with a resounding clank. They were cut off from the rest of the house, entombed in 20 inches of reinforced concrete. Arthur took 2 steps before his legs gave out. He collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the floor. "Arthur!" Genevieve dropped to her knees beside him. In the stark, fluorescent light of the safe room, she saw the blood. It was seeping through his tactical vest, staining the black fabric with a dark, wet gleam. "I'm fine," he gritted out, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "It's a through and through. He caught me as I took him down. You're not fine. You're bleeding to death." Panic flared in her chest, hot and sharp. She ripped the Kevlar jacket off her shoulders, tearing at the hem of her silk nightgown. She didn't care about modesty. She cared about the man bleeding out on the linoleum floor. "Genevieve, stop," he tried to protest, but he lacked the strength to push her hands away. "Shut up and let me help you," she snapped, a sudden, fierce authority entering her voice. She bunched the ruined silk together and pressed it hard against the gunshot wound on his side. Arthur hissed in pain, his head falling back against the concrete wall. His grey eyes, usually so guarded and cold, were blown wide, fixed on her face. For the next 20 minutes, the outside world ceased to exist. The muffled thuds of the ongoing battle upstairs were nothing compared to the sound of Arthur's ragged breathing. Genevieve found a trauma kit in the corner of the safe room. Her hands, trained to delicately command the strings of a cello, were now slick with blood as she packed the wound, relying on adrenaline and pure, stubborn refusal to let him die. When she finally finished wrapping a pressure bandage around his torso, she slumped back against the opposite wall, utterly exhausted. Arthur watched her. The silence in the safe room stretched between them, heavy and raw. "You didn't freeze," Arthur said quietly, his voice raspy. "Most people freeze when the bullets start flying." "I told you," Genevieve replied, wiping a streak of blood from her cheek with the back of her trembling hand. "I understand performance under pressure." A weak, genuine smile touched Arthur's lips. It wasn't the cynical smirk he usually wore. It was something vulnerable. "You saved my life, Genevieve. If you had hesitated opening that door—" He let the sentence trail off. "You saved mine first," she pointed out. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on them. "Why, Arthur? You could have left me upstairs. You could have traded me to Victor. It would have ended the war." Arthur slowly shifted, groaning as he pushed himself up slightly to look her in the eye. The cold, calculating Mafia boss was entirely stripped away, leaving only a man who looked dangerously close to breaking. "Because," Arthur whispered, the word hanging in the sterile air. The wager was a lie. Genevieve frowned, her heart skipping a beat. "What?" "The wager at the Drake Hotel," he continued, his gaze intense, pinning her in place. "It wasn't a game to me. It wasn't a joke to humiliate you. Detroit had already put a hit out on you. I knew it the moment you walked into that ballroom. If I hadn't claimed you, if I hadn't made a public spectacle of binding you to the Costello family, you would have been dead before you reached the parking garage." Genevieve stared at him, the pieces of the last month rapidly realigning in her mind. He hadn't trapped her. He had built a fortress around her. "I've spent my entire life in the dark, Genevieve," Arthur confessed, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "And then you walked into my world, in that ridiculous green dress, completely terrified, but refusing to back down. You were the only honest thing in a room full of liars." He reached out, his blood-stained fingers gently grazing her ankle. "I didn't marry you to use you as a shield. I married you because I couldn't bear the thought of letting them break you." Tears welled in Genevieve's eyes. The monster she had feared, the captor she had resented, had been bleeding for her since the day they met. Suddenly the red emergency phone on the wall of the safe room blared to life. Arthur's hand tightened on her ankle. He nodded towards the phone. Genevieve scrambled up and grabbed the receiver. "Hello? Genevieve?" The voice on the other end wasn't Vincent. It wasn't a police officer. It was a voice she hadn't heard in over a month, a voice she had prayed to hear and now deeply dreaded. "Leo," she breathed, the blood draining from her face. "Listen to me, Jen." Her brother's voice was frantic, laced with a manic edge. "I know the estate is under attack. I gave Detroit the security codes." Genevieve felt the floor drop out from under her. You gave them the codes. You sent them here to kill us." "I sent them to kill Arthur," Leo yelled through the receiver. "He's a monster, Jen. He forced you into this. But it's okay. Victor's men are going to clear the house. Just stay in the safe room, open the door when they knock, and we can finally be free." Genevieve looked down at Arthur, the man who had taken a bullet for her, the man who had stood between her and an army. "Leo," Genevieve said, her voice turning completely unrecognizable, cold, hardened, sounding terrifyingly like a Costello. "Victor Sterling is dead." A dead silence met her on the other end of the line. "And if you ever come near me or my husband again," Genevieve continued, her knuckles white as she gripped the phone, "I won't let Arthur handle you. I'll do it myself." She slammed the phone back onto the receiver, severing the last tie to her past. She turned back to Arthur, the naive music teacher completely gone, replaced by a queen ready to defend her king. "We need to plan our next move," she said. The heavy steel door of the safe room finally hissed open 5 hours later. The man standing on the other side wasn't a Detroit mercenary. It was Vincent. His left arm was in a makeshift sling, and his usually immaculate suit was ruined. But he was alive. Behind him stood a team of private medics Arthur kept on a staggering retainer. "House is clear, boss," Vincent rasped, his eyes dropping to the bloody bandages wrapped around Arthur's waist, and then to Genevieve, whose hands were stained crimson. Vincent's hardened expression shifted into something resembling profound respect. "We mopped up the stragglers. Victor Sterling's body is being relocated." Arthur gave a weak, grim nod, allowing the medics to hoist him onto a stretcher. As they carried him up the stairs, his hand blindly reached out until Genevieve caught it, lacing her fingers through his. The next 48 hours were a blur of antiseptic, hushed phone calls and the heavy, suffocating weight of an impending war. Arthur survived the surgery to remove the bullet, but he was bedridden, hooked to IVs in the estate's master suite. The underworld, however, did not wait for men to heal. With Victor Sterling dead on Costello soil, Victor's father, Roman Sterling, the ruthless head of the Detroit Syndicate, demanded an immediate tribunal. He called upon the National Commission, the shadow governing body of the 5 families. The sit-down was scheduled for midnight at the University Club of Chicago, an exclusive, real-world private establishment on Monroe Street, where the city's billionaires, federal judges, and quiet power brokers mingled. The club's cathedral hall had been completely rented out, its staff dismissed for the night under the guise of private renovations. Arthur tried to get out of bed to attend, his face deathly pale. "If I don't show, Roman will smell blood in the water. The commission will strip our shipping routes by morning." "You'll bleed out before you reach the car," Genevieve said, standing at the foot of his bed. She wasn't wearing a borrowed silk dress or a terrifying diamond collar. She wore a tailored black pantsuit, her hair pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. "I have no choice, Genevieve." "Yes, you do." She walked to his bedside table and picked up the heavy, solid gold Costello signet ring. It had belonged to his father, and Arthur wore it every day. She held it up to the dim light of the bedroom. "I am your wife. I share your name. Under the Commission's archaic laws, a spouse can act as a proxy if the head of the family is incapacitated." Arthur stared at her, stunned. "Genevieve, no. Roman Sterling is a butcher. These men will eat you alive." "Let them try." She slipped the heavy gold ring onto her right index finger. It was loose, but it caught the light like a warning beacon. She leaned down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to his feverish forehead. "You protected me, Arthur. Now it's my turn to protect the board." When Genevieve walked into the cathedral hall of the University Club of Chicago 2 hours later, the silence that fell over the room was absolute. 5 men, the architects of organized crime in America, sat around a massive antique oak table beneath towering stained glass windows. Roman Sterling sat at the far end, his face contorted with grief and rage. When he saw Genevieve, a petite civilian woman, walk in, flanked only by a heavily bandaged Vincent, Roman let out a vicious laugh. "Is this a joke?" Roman slammed his hand on the table. "Arthur sends a music teacher to answer for my son's murder?" Genevieve didn't flinch. She walked to the empty chair at the head of the table, pulling it out with a sharp scrape of wood against stone. She sat down, folding her hands on the table. The gold signet ring gleamed under the chandeliers. "Arthur sends his regrets," Genevieve said, her voice echoing clearly through the cavernous hall. It was the voice of a woman who commanded auditoriums, calm, perfectly pitched, and completely unafraid. "But you will deal with me, Roman, and you will listen very carefully." "I want blood," Roman roared, standing up. "Your husband executed my boy. Your son breached our perimeter with a paramilitary kill squad after bribing a civilian informant," Genevieve countered, her tone turning to ice. She reached into her leather portfolio and tossed a sleek, black flash drive onto the center of the table. "What is that?" asked the head of the New York family, a gray-haired man eyeing her with sudden interest. "That is the recorded audio from our safe room's emergency line," Genevieve stated smoothly. "It features my own brother, Leo Hayes, confessing that Victor Sterling paid him to steal our security codes. Victor intended to assassinate Arthur and myself in our own home. Under Commission Law, Section 4, an unprovoked strike on a Don's residence is an act of treason." Roman paled slightly but bared his teeth. "Audio can be faked. It's not enough." "I agree," Genevieve said, a razor-sharp smile playing on her lips. She reached into her portfolio again and pulled out a stack of financial documents, sliding them across the polished oak. "Which is why I also brought these. Wire transfers. Last week, Victor routed $10 million through Cayman National Bank directly into an offshore shell company owned by a federal prosecutor." The entire table stiffened. "Victor wasn't just trying to kill Arthur," Genevieve continued, her eyes locking onto Roman's terrified face. "He was cutting a deal with the feds to turn state's evidence against all of you in exchange for immunity. Your son was a rat, Roman. Arthur killing him didn't start a war. It saved the entire commission from federal indictments." The silence in the cathedral hall was deafening. The other 4 bosses looked at the documents, then at Roman, their eyes turning predatory. The unwritten law of their world was simple. Rats die, and the families of rats are stripped of their power. Genevieve leaned forward, the Costello ring catching the light. "The Costello family demands reparations for the attack on our home. We are claiming all of Detroit's shipping routes out of the Great Lakes, effective immediately. If you disagree, Roman, I will hand these wire transfers over to the other families, and they can dismantle your empire piece by piece." Roman Sterling sank back into his chair, defeated, his empire crumbling under the weight of a few sheets of paper and the unyielding stare of a 24-year-old music teacher. The ending surprised everyone. The underworld had expected Arthur Costello's wife to be a fragile hostage, a pawn in a bloody chess game. Instead, she had walked into a room full of wolves, completely unarmed, and walked out owning half the Midwest. 6 months later, the Gold Coast room at the Drake Hotel was empty, save for a single cellist playing softly on the stage. The doors had been locked, the staff dismissed for a private, very expensive hour. Genevieve stood near the center of the polished mahogany floor, wearing a simple, elegant white dress. The bruises had faded. The war was over. With Detroit absorbed and Leo permanently exiled to Europe with strict orders never to return, the Costello Syndicate had begun heavily transitioning into legitimate, untouchable global logistics. Footsteps echoed softly from the shadows. Arthur emerged, looking entirely recovered, devastatingly handsome in a bespoke suit. He walked up to her, his slate-grey eyes entirely devoid of the cold, cynical edge they once held. "You rented out the ballroom," Genevieve noted, a soft smile touching her lips. "I felt we had unfinished business here," Arthur murmured, stopping inches from her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. He didn't drop to one knee. That wasn't who they were. But he opened the box to reveal a stunning, flawless diamond ring. Not a family heirloom, stained with blood, but something entirely new. "6 months ago, I made a cruel wager," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "I forced you into a waltz to save your life, and in return, you saved mine. You saved my empire. You saved my soul." He took the ring from the box. "I don't want a marriage on paper anymore, Genevieve. I don't want a wager. I want you. Only you." Genevieve looked at the man who had terrified her, protected her, and ultimately surrendered his entire heart to her. She placed her left hand on his shoulder, her right hand slipping perfectly into his. "1, 2, 3, she whispered. Arthur smiled, stepping into the rhythm as the cellist began to play a beautiful, sweeping melody. And as they waltzed across the empty ballroom, there were no threats, no monsters in the shadows, and no debts to pay. Just a king and his queen, dancing to a rhythm they had finally written together. And that is the incredible conclusion. The Mafia boss laughed when he made that terrifying wager, expecting to break her spirit. But the ending truly surprised everyone when the quiet music teacher didn't just survive the Costello Empire. She conquered it. Genevieve stepped into the ultimate lion's den, outsmarted the most dangerous men in the country, and turned a forced paper marriage into a reign of absolute power and genuine, unshakable love. If this epic story of betrayal, survival, and high-stakes romance kept you on the edge of your seat, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow, and lets me know you want more stories just like this. Share this video with anyone who loves a brilliant plot twist, and make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments, what was your favorite twist, and did you see Genevieve's ultimate power play coming? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.